And I recently posted on Twitter about this NIL roundtable. Nick Saban was on it, and I put out a tweet talking about how I felt about it and being a college athlete and going through the experience. Over 1 million views. So I decided, I'm like, let me go and figure out who has the knowledge in this space. All right, here we go. Welcome back, guys, to Net Worth. I am your host, Justin Pugh. I want to give a quick shout out to Athlete Podcast Network for graciously hosting this show. And allow me to remind you to go like and subscribe to our channel, this video. Keep sharing. We're getting more and more guests on. Today, we are talking NIL. And I recently posted on Twitter about this NIL roundtable. We had a roundtable at Congress. Nick Saban was on it, and I put out a tweet talking about how I felt about it and being a college athlete and going through the experience. It ended up being a little bit of a hot button topic. Over 1 million views. So I decided, I'm like, let me go and figure out who has the knowledge in this space. And that leads to the guest we have on our show today. Let me introduce you, Darren Heitner. He's a beast. I'm going to give you your intro, Darren, so don't jump in just yet. He's a sports trademark and copyright lawyer. He wrote a book called How to Play the Game, What Every Sports Attorney Needs to Know. He's a Florida Gator through and through. I got DJ Humphrey, my best friend. He's a Florida Gator as well. He's a Miami-based attorney, specializes in sports law, entertainment law, music law, intellectual property law. His client list was so long that I just cut it out. I mean, you can go find it. It's everyone from the top athletic stars to music and entertainment. He does it all. You're a professor. You have a founder and chief editor of a blog. Without further ado, Darren Heitner, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. And I like that DJ Humphrey shout out. Shout out DJ. I've actually done some legal work for him. Shout out Gators. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, he is, when I signed with the Arizona Cardinals, he was, I was left guard. He was the left tackle, and he became one of my best friends. So I became a Florida Gator fan through him. So I cheer for the Gators.
I appreciate having you as part of the crew.
Yeah, for sure. And now, hold on. First off, not many lawyers look like this. We got the tank top. We're in South Florida. We got the wind going by. How did you get into law to begin with? What was the path to even go to law school and get involved?
You see what you get. You get what you see with me. I'm not going to hide behind a suit. In fact, if I don't have to wear one, you'll never see me in one. You're lucky you have a shirt on me when we're doing this interview. Going back to 2007, I had just graduated my undergraduate studies at University of Florida with a political science degree, minors in mass communications and geography. What the hell are you going to do with that, right? So decided I was going to go to law school, but actually not with the intention of practicing law. I had a dream of becoming an agent. In fact, 2 years prior to that, I had an amazing experience interning at a sports agency in Atlanta, Georgia called Career Sports Entertainment, founded by a gentleman named Lonnie Cooper. They had a baseball division, a coaching practice, broadcasters, no longer a football division, although Todd France, who's a football agent, got his start there before moving on. And I soaked up that experience. I loved it so much that summer between my sophomore and junior year of undergrad that I decided to start a website that ultimately became Sports Agent Blog, sportsagentblog.com. And it's still alive today, almost 20 years later, not nearly as active as before. But so going into the summer of 2007, I knew I wanted to go to law school, but I thought I was going in order to give myself some more background, to think differently as a lawyer does, to potentially help clients as I decided I was going to start up my own sports agency from scratch. And that's what I did. I did that for 3 years while I was in law school. Built a sports agency. Instead of clerking over the summers, which traditionally law school students will do to get experience at law firms, I was working on building up that agency. I represented basketball players overseas. I represented baseball players. I represented professional bowlers with their endorsement contracts. So a little bit of everything. And when I graduated, again, fully intending 2010 to move down back to South Florida, where I'm from, and build up this sports agency. Lo and behold, I had a unique opportunity to learn and observe what a law firm environment looked like. A former law school graduate of the University of Florida asked me to come in. I worked there for a year. And in that year, I said to myself, you know what? I actually prefer practicing law over being an agent. And that's when I pivoted and, coming up soon on full 15 years of practicing. And actually this year celebrating 10 years since I started my own practice, Heitner Legal.
Now, when you first got involved in law and decided to leave the sports agency component behind, did you stay involved with sports the entire time, or did you go and start representing, companies, or how did that transition out of sports into law? How did you get back into the sports world?
I wish it was so simple that I could just merely put one part of my life aside, which is practicing as a sports agent, and convert all of those individuals who were, I guess, technically my competitors into clients. Now, that was the game plan long term, and it's fortunately worked out, but no, it did not happen overnight. So my first job out of law school at a law firm was primarily working on behalf of insurance carriers, defending claims, mostly property damage claims. Down here in South Florida and Florida at large, we had experienced a lot of hurricanes back then. And so there were a lot of claims relating to hurricane damage, or just dropping a can opener on your tile and saying that you needed a whole new set of tile for your entire house. So I say it was the worst and best year of my career. It was terrible. I didn't really love working on behalf of insurance carriers. I didn't love my bosses at the time, but I really loved getting thrown into the fire, doing depositions, drafting discovery, responding to discovery, going to hearings, even getting some trial experience as a first year. So, but what I did was, in whatever off time that I had, I tried my best to start branding myself as a subject matter expert, and then also building a book of business. And so you led by saying I do intellectual property work and also sports work. I would start writing about different copyright related matters that interested me, trademark related matters that interested me, covering the sports business and sports law, whether it be at Sports Agent Blog, or then I started writing at Forbes and Inc. magazine, and sort of becoming that subject matter expert. So then I could expand beyond this area of insurance defense that I didn't really love.
So you start to progress, you start to kind of write more about it. How do you end up getting involved in athletics and college athletics? How did you get involved in NIL? Was NIL kind of this like eye-opening experience where you're like, oh, I've been preparing for this my whole life, but not even knowing it? Or how did you get involved with the NIL space?
I guess that's actually a good way of putting it. I was preparing it for it without knowing it. It wasn't something that I wrote down or strategized. I never really envisioned that this would become a component of my practice. Now, I've been working on behalf of professional athletes, sports agents, brands, etc., in the world of sports for over a decade. But obviously, this concept of working with college athletes and now even high school athletes with respect to their endorsement, marketing, autograph, appearance, collective related agreements, that was never something that was in my mind. And, it was a matter of putting myself in the right position and timing. And so going back to 2019, California was the very first state that decided it was going to take proactive measures to basically interfere with the NCAA's prohibitions on college athletes enjoying the fruits of their publicity rights, i.e., name, image, and likeness. And it passed a piece of legislation signed by Governor Newsom that effectively restricted the NCAA from pushing forward with its existing prohibitions. But that wasn't to go live for 4 years from then. So not until 2023. I was then contacted by a representative of my district who was in and is still in the Florida House of Representatives, as well as his legislative aide. And they had essentially said, we see what's happening in California. We know it's a blue/liberal state, and that it may want to push this measure forward for a different reason than we do. And the representative being a Republican and conservative, but we're interested in taking up this charge here in the state of Florida as well. Would you, Darren Heitner, be interested in working with us, brainstorming, strategizing, figuring out, do we want to just copy what they did in California or make it our own and make it better? And I jumped at the opportunity. And then they found me because I had been writing about being an athlete advocate for so long, writing about why it didn't make sense to prohibit athletes from enjoying these rights that literally everyone else across the country can enjoy. And so the moment I was asked to be involved, I gladly accepted. And I suppose that would be the inflection point and how I got involved at such an early stage. I can't believe it's 4 years ago now. And from there, it was also taking my existing practice, which had worked with all these athletes and agents, et cetera, and supplementing it with this new NIL work, which was a perfect fit.
And I guess to kind of just paint a picture before we dive into NIL, could you explain what NIL is, how it was used previously within the NCAA, if you have any light on that, and how the NCAA may have benefited from it, and now how the players are being able, or the athletes are being able to benefit from it now?
I'll do my best. I
Yeah.
teach a course on NIL that spans many, many hours, so I'll try to do this within only a few minutes. Name, image, and likeness, or NIL, is a part of a person's publicity rights, which is inherently commercial in nature. Publicity rights are derived from an individual's right to privacy. Right to privacy has existed for centuries. Rights of publicity is a newer concept that really came about roughly a century ago. About half the states in the United States recognize an individual's right to publicity by statute, by law. Otherwise, the other states recognize it based on case law that's been developed over time. But as I mentioned earlier, everyone has this right of publicity, whether it be codified by statute or through courts of law. What the NCAA did is it came in and said, under our bylaws, we're going to prohibit college athletes from enjoying these same rights.
Is that where the student athlete term came in? I know there were some rights in terms of like workers' comp, but like, was that their way, the NCAA's way of getting around it? I've heard that in the past.
Well, that's not the phrase student athlete was not derived specifically in conjunction or coordination with this prohibition of NIL rights. But the concept of a student athlete and amateurism has always been the crutch for the NCAA to try to distinguish itself and its rules from what's generally accepted. It has tried so desperately to distinguish it and the product it provides through college sports from professionalized sports, mainly through this concept of amateurism, which lately has been called out by many courts of law. And I don't know why it took so long, but yeah, it's a farce, right? So anyway, going back, athletes in general, athletes, celebrities, influencers, these are people who really have the capacity and proclivity to take advantage of their rights of publicity, or NIL. And so what state laws and court decisions have mostly focused on is what happens when a brand or a third party uses someone's name, image, or likeness without that person's consent in some sort of advertising or promotion. Well, that athlete, that celebrity, that influencer needs to have the capacity to sue and to receive some form of relief. And it's important that that right be provided to athletes, but also that they can enter into their own arrangements and do their own deals where they're endorsing companies and products and services, marketing them, just licensing their names, images, and likenesses so that companies can use that on their own products and on their own advertising, or just athletes being able to start their own companies, which oftentimes the NCAA prohibited because it viewed the athletes as utilizing their athletic fame for economic gain, and that's what it wanted to avoid. Yeah. Gosh, the NCAA pushed so hard against this for so many years.
And what was their case? Like, I mean, I was a part of this. Like, I was played college athletics, and I saw guys that came in and had these unbelievable careers, but never could profit off it, and then never even made it to the NFL, and were never able to cash in when they were supposed to. I just don't understand how the NCAA got away with, I don't want to say robbery, but like they got the profit off the name, image, and likeness of all of these athletes for so long. And that's kind of where my gripe was with it. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, look at a perfect example of what's displayed in front of our eyes over the past couple of weeks. Jack Golke from Oakland We'll never see him play professional basketball. He'll probably never make as much money related to athletics as he's made over the past couple of weeks being a brand ambassador for various brands. And that's the beauty of this, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, the NCAA has for so long been able to utilize the names, images, and likenesses of the athletes for their own commercial gain, at the same time preventing the athletes from doing the same, even when it wouldn't conflict with their either the associations, the conferences, or the individual schools' relationships with third parties. Ed O'Bannon deserves a lot of credit. He brought a case roughly a decade ago related to the use of publicity rights, specifically likenesses, in video games, and that's why we saw Electronic Arts stall its production of NCAA football for so many years, only now finally bringing it back. So, the NCAA has been able to get away with it for so long, but now not only, use Ed O'Bannon as an example of charting this path, but now there's even pending litigation that seeks redress for recent years prior to July 1, 2021, when the NCAA said we're no longer going to generally prohibit this. Now there's plaintiffs out there that are seeking relief because of the fact that they were improperly denied opportunities to exploit their NIL prior to that.
So when those dollars came in, I look at a guy, let's go back to Florida, and Tim Tebow, maybe the biggest star ever to play in college football. And Tim obviously wasn't able to capitalize. And I mean, we can only imagine the amount of dollars he would have been able to generate during that time. Where do those dollars go then? If they're not going into Tim Tebow's pockets, where are they going?
Well, I don't know that the hard part about that question is it inherently requires a lot of speculation.
Yeah.
I mean, a Fortune 500 company may have gladly spent an exorbitant amount of money on Tim Tebow to get, let's say, exclusive rights in their category and have a long-term relationship with him. Does that company necessarily repurpose that capital and spend it elsewhere, and specifically, let's say, on a deal with a school? I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it necessarily went somewhere else, but I think it's reasonable to state that with limited options, if a brand wants to get into sports and, let's say, wants to somehow be associated or affiliated with Tim Tebow, well, an alternative is associate with the University of Florida. Now, you won't be able to use Tim Tebow's image and likeness in your advertising, but in the years that Florida's winning national championships, maybe you get some indirect benefit from that association.
Yeah, because I saw the documentary about Johnny Manziel and the dollars that he generated for Texas A&M, and it forced players like Johnny and Reggie Bush, just because they're the two most famous of my generation, to take some improper benefits and to go out there and face that. So it just creates this ecosystem where it's like us versus them. We're not all in this together. And the way I look at college athletics is like we have this amazing ability to generate revenue. The NFL generates $20 billion a year. I can't imagine what college football and college athletics generates in totality per year. Do we get to a point where, I know players have tried to unionize in the past, do we get to a point where there's some salary cap, almost NFL-like system in place for the major college sports? I know you work with all college athletes, from women's sports to all across the board. Is there some way where at some point, college football has a salary cap and college basketball does, and we're able to, instead of going to donors every year, because that's also not sustainable, and we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But how do we fix the problem there?
Well, I guess you first have to define what the problem is and whether it's objectively a problem or subjectively a problem, depending on who you're speaking with. If I'm a college athlete in football or basketball right now, I don't think there's any problem whatsoever. I think we're probably in the golden age, and you may never have a better situation than what you currently have, which is unrestricted free agency on a year-to-year basis. And the capacity to fill the void of the lack of salaries by way of collective contracts. and still do NIL work and so on and so forth. I think we went very quickly from a situation where athletes were incredibly depressed by the rules of the NCAA to one where I think college athletes in many respects have more rights than professional athletes and are in a better position
So
to
it would be
exploit those rights.
it would be a disservice for them to unionize right now because they probably would
Well,
have to give back some of those rights. I look at it because I'm a part of the NFLPA, part of our union. Everything's collectively bargained on, and agreed. If I could have free agency twice a year, where I can, I saw a college player committed to an SEC school, then transferred back to a Big Ten school, then
yeah,
went back to the SEC school. I'm sure you know about it. You actually wrote about it.
Proctor.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I didn't know if we could talk about it, but
sure.
that's
He's
better
not my
than
client.
what I ever could do at the NFL level right now. So I guess how
Yeah.
do we it was broken in favor of I guess against the players before, and now it may be broken a little bit in favor too much of the players. How do we find that happy medium?
Well, that's difficult. You asked earlier about the employment unionization collective bargaining component. One thing I find very interesting is you have recently had this effort by Dartmouth basketball players to unionize. And there was a vote 13-2, and that's now under appeal. Dartmouth says it won't even recognize the athletes as employees in the meantime. But take a step back. Why is it that no other group of athletes around the country have gone through this process in the wake of Dartmouth players effectively succeeding in their effort? Why is it that there's an ongoing NLRB dispute similar to what happened with Dartmouth players, but with USC and UCLA, yet it's not the players who are behind it, it's an advocacy group? Do players really want to become employees? Do they want to unionize? Do they want to collectively bargain? And it goes back to my earlier comment, which is sort of like, we know we're in a really good situation right now. There's an unknown of what happens if we become employees and we're collectively bargaining. I mean, what we know is that as employees, the schools will have additional consequences of paying insurance, workers' comp, probably losing some of the tax exempt status that they have. But as athletes, are they now subject to losing their scholarships, losing their grants and aid, being able to be terminated and kicked off the team at any moment in time for any reason whatsoever if they're at will? And then if we go down the path of unionization and collectively bargaining, well, one thing you probably know as a member of the NFLPA, when you get involved in collectively bargaining, now all of these cases that we're seeing play out in the college space based on antitrust, including the current case with the attorneys general of Tennessee and Virginia, where the preliminary injunction was put in place to prevent the NCAA from enforcing its rule that precludes inducements to high school athletes and transfer portal athletes. Now you can't sue on antitrust grounds. Now labor law comes into play. So you're giving up some of these really important rights that you have. What's the solution? What's really interesting to me is how hard schools, through their presidents and athletic directors, conference commissioners, and the NCAA has fought against employment of athletes, because I think you can actually benefit a lot by then putting in restrictions on movement, restrictive covenants as provisions within employment contracts. Again, I understand, and I think that the big schools, the major conferences in the Big Ten and the SEC could easily get away with this within their budgets, their existing budgets, or at least make up for it. Where there would be a big problem, I think, is with the smaller schools that don't have those massive amounts of revenue. And maybe the solution is changing the scope of the NCAA and not having all of these schools fall within Division I versus Division II, Division III, but add either more divisions or something of the like. There has to be solutions out there. But gosh, based on inaction by the NCAA, by the schools, that's what's created this ecosystem currently. And I don't see it getting better anytime soon for the schools, the conferences, and the NCAA who are complaining, unless Congress decides to get involved, which was the subject of our roundtable with Senator Cruz not so long ago.
Yeah, and that's really what woke me up to it. I'm part of a collective at Syracuse, and I want to talk about collectives in a minute. But let's go back to the roundtable because you mentioned it. We had Nick Saban come out and basically say, due to NIL, it's taken some of the passion away for what he loved about coaching, his ability to impact young people. And Nick Saban is the greatest of all time. He's the greatest coach. He came to the NFL and he left because of I would say, in my opinion, the business of the NFL, where players are making as much as the coach or much more. And players are talking back to coaches as peers and equals. And there's a definite personality to be successful at college football. What irked me a little bit about what Nick Saban said was that it was always about developing players. It was never about the money. And schools like the SEC, and I play with multiple guys that have played at those schools, there is this unspoken, and you don't have to, I don't need you to agree or disagree or anything like that, but it was an unspoken payment of players going on in college football. Let's look at the ones that were caught, the Johnny Manziels and the Reggie Bushes. So we just think that Johnny Manziel was a one-time thing or Reggie Bush, we would be naive to think that. So when Nick Saban said, like, now that players are getting money, I think I translated to now that every player can get money and not just the guys that I was bringing in. That's when he started to lose his passion for the game. Because if Nick Saban just wanted to develop players, there's a lot of high school teams out there where you can really make an impact for no dollars. And that's what a little bit irked me. But then he said something has to change. And he did kind of to readjust. So I guess my question is, A, how did you get involved with the roundtable? How are they like, Darren, we need you here on Capitol Hill talking with Cruz and Nick Saban? That is quite the trio you guys had there. And these are massive implications for what's going to go forward with NIL. So I guess, A, what was your opinion on Saban and his takes? And then how did the whole roundtable, go about and your thoughts there?
Well, overall, I thought that Coach Saban added a lot to the discussion. And not only during the discussion, but I had a chance to speak with him afterwards as well. I think the biggest criticism, which really took grabbed the most attention in headlines and then among fans who read those headlines, was when Coach Saban essentially said that college sports is not a business. Like, please, of course it's a business.
Yeah.
But what I found refreshing, surprising, and led me to have some optimism was to hear Coach Saban, and not just Coach Saban, but also the athletic director at Alabama, the commissioner of the ACC, and others come around to the concept of revenue sharing. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that this was something that could absolutely not be put on the table if you talk to coaches or anyone in an athletic department. And so to hear everyone pretty much be in unison, in agreement that this is something that needs to occur, just shows you how far we've come from the days of Mark Emmert saying we can't allow athletes to even have NIL rights because it opens Pandora's box. The other part that I thought was interesting and has received very little coverage was Coach Saban saying that even classifying college athletes as employees, similar to how NFL teams operate, would be preferable over the status quo. And that goes back to my comment earlier, which is, you have like these Twitter lawyers and others who say employment for the athlete. This is what the athlete needs. Well, is it? Is it beneficial for most athletes? Do most athletes really want that? Or is it oddly something that would be beneficial for the schools absent congressional involvement, which would classify athletes as not being employees and provide a lot of other protections to the schools? And to me, it seems like it would be better for the schools than the athletes, most likely. Now, the consequences for some of the cases that are currently pending related to the misclassification of athletes, that's a separate subject. That could cause devastating consequences for the schools from an economic standpoint, or to the NCAA and the conferences. I think your other question was, how did I get there?
Yeah.
It was a bit of a surprise, although I've been communicating with Senator Cruz's staff for quite some time. at least months and perhaps longer than a year. And behind the scenes, we've been chatting about NIL in general, but also, what it's going to take in order for Congress to ultimately pass any sort of legislation. And so when we've had these more than 10 different hearings on Capitol Hill, whether it be in the House or in the Senate, I've always tuned in, and it's sort of been like a circus to me. You never stay on topic. It's always this person or that person talking about his or her alma mater, and then you don't even stay on NIL. It gets into transgender sports, and it's really hard to watch, to be honest.
Don't worry, I don't have any of those questions popping up later on the show, so you're good.
But this roundtable stayed very much on subject. I thought it was very serious, and I knew going into it that if there's going to be legislation that ever gets out of committee and ever has a chance of passing, it's going to have Senator Cruz's blessing. And that, even though I wasn't necessarily optimistic going into this roundtable that it was going to bear any fruit, I at least knew that if there's a path, and I'm not necessarily saying that Congress should get involved, but if there is a path, it's probably through this type of vehicle. And again, having sat through it and been there in person, I was very pleasantly surprised. And honestly, it was such an honor to be invited. I had no expectation of being invited. I know some other people who were sort of on the B list. Admittedly, I'm somewhat surprised given who was on that panel that I wasn't on the B list. But it was a great experience, and hopefully, I had a bit of wisdom to add.
Because I think when you look at the NIL space, and I can just speak from personal experience at Syracuse, a school that didn't have that behind the scenes ability to pay players like some other schools have in the past. We were swimming, we were struggling, but it gives schools like the Michigans of the world that were always a little bit behind. We saw in the national championship this year, Michigan out toughed Alabama. There was a change in the landscape of football, and the product on the field now all of a sudden it's not just what SEC school is going to win this year. It was always the conversation. Now there's other schools like Syracuse. We now brought in the best recruiting class we've had in years. Do we think that eventually, once this Wild Wild West gets situated, we will have more parity across sports, or will the big schools then again be able to, there's still Alabama, we still have that brand that we're going to be able to bring in the most dollars? I guess that depends on what Congress does, or how do you feel like the landscape of and the fairness of play? Because that, at the end of the day, the entertainment on TV and having a school like Washington, who, no offense to Washington, never think you'd see them play for a national championship, had them in the conversation was good for the sport.
Right. Who wants to live in a city where it rains every day? So yes, I do believe that NIL mixed with the transfer portal, which are not one and the same, but from a timing perspective, sort of feel like they are, that they have already and will continue to not necessarily create this constant parity, but provide an opportunity to make the shifting of the balance of power in college sports quite fluid. Because now it's not those behind the scenes transactions and less control in the hands of a particular coach. Now you have these third-party collectives and boosters who are able to contribute significant capital and persuade a player to go to a Syracuse or Washington as opposed to Alabama or Georgia, which may have not been the case prior to July 1, 2021. We'll never see the parity that you do see in let's say the NFL. And I know some people may be thinking, well, what parity when the New England Patriots win so many championships over a short period of time? But look, I mean, that just goes to incredible salary cap administration, a really good coach, and a chemistry and an amazing quarterback, obviously. But you won't have that parity in college sports on a constant basis unless there is that type of salary cap system that you alluded to earlier, which will require most likely employment status and collective bargaining agreement that essentially creates a floor and a cap for schools to pay players directly. I don't know that that's ever going to happen. Some people seem to think that they can predict the future and it's going to happen in 6 months or 1 year or whatever. I'm not on board with that. I have no clue what's going to happen. But even if that doesn't occur, I do think that this NIL mixed with transfer portal, it creates a lot of chaos in the mind of the fan because you don't know if the player that you're rooting for this year is going to be the same player that you're rooting for next year. But I also think that going into each year, you don't necessarily know who's going to be making the CFP.
No, that makes a ton of sense, which is great. And it, honestly, after listening to this conversation, it kind of it 100% changes my perspective on right now. The athletes are to your words, it's a golden age for the athletes. But the every team almost has an unwritten salary cap now. I've talked to guys from across the league. We know how much it's going to take for, and you've heard Ryan Day at Ohio State allude to it's going to take this much, or Matt Rule has mentioned, we need this much to get a quarterback in the portal right now. These collectives almost become the general manager, the owner of the team without, I'm not putting, firm ties on it, but that's how this happens because they're paying a lot of these athletes. What is a collective? Who makes up a collective? How is it legal? What's the profit versus nonprofit route? Can we just jump into collectives here for a minute? Because I think a lot of people don't understand where this money's coming from and how
Yeah.
it's getting deployed to the players.
Well, it's interesting. You use the phrase general manager. You now actually have positions at universities like NIL general manager, which is quite interesting to me. Collectives. So every collective has the capacity to be different from each other. Generally, what we see when you go to a collective's website is the front-facing opportunity for the general fan is this sort of subscription model where you pay on a monthly basis for different tiers of access. And that money goes towards a pool that is then distributed to athletes at the university of which the collective supports. But in reality, while fans are contributing, and to me, it doesn't really feel great when the collectives or the big boosters are begging the hardworking fans to put in their money towards this effort. But in the reality it is those boosters. It's usually like 5 to 10 to 15 major boosters who have traditionally provided capital to the athletic departments who put in a lot more than those small monthly subscriptions into this pool. And then you have organizers, managers of these collectives who are making the decisions, obviously with some insight from the schools, even though the NCAA probably wants to turn its head, as to where the money should be deployed in what amounts, and broken down in which ways. I wrote about this recently. The collectors are becoming smarter and perhaps putting in language that like buyout language, which coaches have if players are going to transfer, or trying to backload contracts to prevent against athletes just taking money and leaving. And also a lot of non-guaranteed language, similar to what NFL players see in their contracts, where they may get a big chunk of money up front, but then a lot of the other money is actually contingent on the collectives even deciding to require the athletes to perform certain deliverables. So that's an idea of what a collective is and how it operates. And to me, what they tend to be, first and foremost, is filling a vacuum because there's an appetite for athletes to get paid for their services, but currently schools can't pay them. And so this is the void that's being filled by many of these collectives. Now, some of these collectives have become wiser and are actually trying to make a profit. Even though they're spending all this money on the players, many of the collectives have now developed their contracts in a way where I find them to be very one-sided toward the collective as opposed to the player. And players really would do a service for themselves to get reputable representation to review and revise and negotiate these deals. To the for-profit, not-for-profit, a lot of collectives started out as not-for-profit thinking they could provide this incentive to donors as a tax write-off. And then the IRS got involved and said, hey, you may want to think twice about this. And so we've seen some collectives fold because of it. We've seen some reorganize to truly be for-profit, and others remain as not-for-profit, thinking that if scrutinized, they'll be able to overcome whatever battles are forthcoming.
Now, when you look at an NIL deal and these collectives are paying players to provide services, so now they have to do some type of marketing work for them or endorsement work for the collective. Players don't necessarily have to work with a collective. They can have brands come directly to them, or do you need to have a collective or an agent, or how does that work? And I know you've worked with some athletes, so maybe you can provide some light there.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, early on, I would say, sure, you could sign your collective deal and do whatever you want. But I've started to see deals with collectives where the collectives are trying to essentially get the exclusive licensing rights for the players in exchange for the money that they're providing. Where, some collectives ask that the athletes provide an assignment of any right to enter into group licensing deals. So, if let's say the collective is going to sign a bunch of players to a trading card company and that's a group licensing deal. Well, sorry, player, you can't control it. We're going to do what we think is right, and we're going to take the commissions from that. Same with talking about NCAA football, the video game that's coming back, another type of group licensing deal. And some go even further than that and try to be agents and try to take commissions off of deals that they negotiate or even those that they don't negotiate. So we're seeing so much change. And, part of the reason why there's more activity and more shouting about a need for a uniform contract is because of just that. I mean, every contract I see nowadays differs from one collective to the other, and some are okay. Some require very little redlining and negotiating. Others we've just completely walked away from, and a player will transfer.
Now, I looked at, speaking of contracts, I heard a story about a defensive lineman from the University of Florida, now with the Chicago Bears, that gave up like future earnings. And I know that's happened in baseball with some of the Latin American players. What are our thoughts on that? What would you recommend to a player? It's getting a lawyer involved like yourself to begin with,
I
because
reviewed that contract, just to be clear. It
okay,
hasn't come out yet. It's going to come out soon. There's an article coming out in a major publication. I reviewed that contract. And ultimately, look, I have no problem with the company that put the contract in front of the player. It's signed many other players, professional and now in the college space. It's a business. It doesn't hide the fact that it's a business. It's taking a chance by giving money to the player up front, and then with a potential massive windfall down the road if the player succeeds. That's the business model.
it's almost like the
Now,
VC. It's almost like the VC model. They're trying to go 1 for 10 and hit on that one guy that makes it and becomes a star in the NFL.
absolutely, and it's done so in the world of professional baseball, which it's now used that model to do deals elsewhere. Now, that said, the deal has to make sense, and that's where I have a problem with this particular deal because one is, how badly do you need the money? Can you get the money elsewhere? And is the percent, like, the amount of money is not the issue. It's the percentage that you're going to be giving up going forward that's the issue. And it pains me to know that the player entered into that deal because, it's about betting on yourself. Again, unless you really desperately need the money and can't find the money elsewhere. But assuming you're going to have a successful career in the NFL, you're going to have to give back a lot of money. Is there any way to negotiate down that percentage? And there's only so much we can do as advocates, as representatives. We can call out and point out the issues with an agreement. And then at the end of the day, it's up to the principal to decide whether to enter into it or not. Again, I don't have an issue with the concept of the contract. I really don't. I just think it's important for athletes to not only get advice of counsel, but rely on it.
100%. And I think having a team in place, everyone always talks about the team. You need to have a team in place when you're 18 years old coming into these college programs now, because the dollars are going to be real. Have you ran into guys having issues with taxes? Because you don't know what taxes are because you really haven't had a job if you're playing sports at a high level. Guys withholding the taxes, making sure they're doing the right things. Because I think a lot of them think, I'm just going to get this cash and go spend it. Have you seen any issues in terms of, I know collectives have had issues with the IRS, but players?
I personally haven't seen anything yet. It's not to say that I won't. I'm also not necessarily surprised because oftentimes these are non-legal issues. You would typically go to an accountant, to a CPA, if the IRS is sending you a notice. Sometimes those CPAs or accountants would come to me, but I personally haven't seen anything. I've heard a lot of people say this is going to become a nightmare for players, but I can only speak from personal experience, and I have not had a single instance of an issue with the IRS for a college player come to me thus far.
And the one thing that I do want to shine a light on, and I know you had some male and female athletes involved in this. For women's sports, is this probably the best opportunity that they've had? I look at Caitlin Clark just got offered $10 million from Barstool. I mean, when have
Yeah,
we ever seen a WNBA contract that large? You've worked with
no,
some women athletes in athletics. Is this the best thing to ever happen for women's sports at the college level?
the best. I
Yeah.
mean, I've worked with the Kavanagh twins since the beginning of NIL, July 1, 2021, and Hannah's not even in college sports anymore. Haley left and is coming back at TCU, but right now she's not playing. And we're still bombarded with opportunities. And I can't even tell you, with respect to deal flow, how many different contracts I've reviewed in the past 3 years for them. I've lost count. I mean, we obviously haven't entered into every single deal,
Yeah.
but imagine a world where NIL didn't exist. These girls, these women wouldn't have had the incredible opportunity that's life changing, just life changing, significant money, and essentially being able to create careers off of it. They've taken, I mean, you could take an entrepreneurship class in school, it means nothing. They've actually gone through a real entrepreneurship course. Like, they know how to run businesses. They just started a brand new like workout fitness routine business from scratch on their own, and they're crushing it. Like, this wasn't allowed by the NCAA prior to that. Caitlin Clark, another great example. I do work for Gatorade. We did a deal with her for Gatorade. This is life changing. I'm sure she'll do great in WNBA. How much money is she going to make from that? I don't know. Would she have even had the same surrounding that brand equity going into the WNBA absent NIL? Maybe, but it calls for speculation. We just know what the situation is now. It's so exciting for those players that just like, I don't know, would have had anywhere close to the opportunities that they have today. I love it. I love it.
I just had a daughter. My daughter's 2 months old, and I
Mine's
now
4 months.
yeah, so we're right in the same boat. So not getting a lot of sleep. And I look at the
Yeah.
opportunities that are being provided for women in athletics now. I think maybe just USA Soccer was the only sport that was like eclipsing the men, and they still weren't even making the same amount as the men's side was making. To now bring that brand recognition to the women's athletics, I think it is single handedly the best thing that could have ever happened to women's sports at the college level. So it gives me hope when I say to my daughter, "Hey, we're going to go out there and play soccer, and we're going to go play whatever the sport is, basketball." And now there's an avenue for her to pursue that excellence and build a brand and generate revenue off that brand. So the one thing I always look at it was broken before, and maybe now it's broken the other way on the spectrum. But I'd prefer for the system to be broken in favor of the athletes and the players that are out there producing the content that everyone tunes in to see. So I guess I'll leave you with this last question.
Yeah.
The NIL isn't going away. There's this landscape is here. This wild, wild west is here. In your dream scenario, looking at both sides, because you've seen, okay, the coaches and the universities and the NCAA, they have their gripes and the players had their gripes. Where do we find this common ground? If you were put in charge, hey, Darren, we need you to figure out the structure that we're all going to live by going forward. What does it look like to keep everyone happy and keep the business of college athletics moving forward and growing?
Gosh, that's a tough question. I think Charlie Baker has it right to a certain extent, which is there's no grounds for removing the schools from the equation. Schools should be able to pay athletes directly. Now, again, I'm not certain that it's in the athlete's best interest for that payment to be in the form of W-2 compensation. So is there a way for schools through some sort of uniform contract, taking some of that control out of the hands of the collectives to pay the athletes directly as a form of a license for NIL rights, which Charlie Baker has suggested, and do so in a way where you can add language that brokers for a preclusion on movement, not requiring athletes to enter into these deals, not requiring athletes to give up their rights to move, but just as you would do in any employer-employee negotiation outside of collective bargaining, allowing the parties to freely negotiate those terms. And if the deal's good enough for the athlete, it's multi-years, and you have those bells and whistles that add some stability for the school, for the coaches. I suppose that's a solution. But I think any solution to quote unquote fix the current problem, which I suppose is the lack of stability with the players freely transferring, would have to be school involvement.
Yeah, I think as we negotiate and we navigate our way through this, it's ever evolving. I'm sure you're going to continue to be more and more involved. So, Darren, I really appreciate you coming on and providing some perspective. This is huge. I think from an NFL standpoint, I look at it from how we've done it, and this is how it has to be. And a lot of the fans out there have said they've lost interest in the sports because the business gets involved. The college athletics has never been more popular. The NFL has never been more popular. Women's sports, people are more excited to tune into the college Final Four right now and what they have going on than in the men's. And I think that is a great thing for the world we live in as we raise children and daughters into this world and continue to put more athletes, pockets in the dollars in the pockets of athletes. So, yeah. Darren, I really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you on Capitol Hill at the next conversation. If there's ever a way we can help you out here and be involved, we would love to. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. This is fun.